Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money. I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. I am afraid we will pay for it in the most cruel and unjust way. War Minister Theotokis, August 1922. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Diogenes Lamp podcast. We have the Greek Civil War segment still ongoing here. What episode are we here? 22 of the series. Bread, Olives, and King Constantine, Greek Monarchism, part 5 of this little primer we have on the Greek monarchy. Welcome back to the pod. Just some small housekeeping things. Like I said, I think I said this last episode too, but going forward, I'm going to keep this kind of solo monologue. Nothing, everything with me and everyone else is fine, but it's just a decision I made. Just because people are busy and it's hard to get co-hosts on here. And I want to stay committed to keeping a consistent stream of episodes, a weekly episode, just so I can get through this series, within the next decade. And all the co-hosts that have come on are entirely doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. Basil, Nate, Jess, everyone that's ever been on here as a co-host of the series. It was a decision I made. It's going to be for the better. I'll be able to get stuff more consistently. We'll still have those guys on and other guests and other just friends as well. And, we'll make jokes and bullshit and whatever like we've done in the past. But it's going to be more so if you've ever listened to Mike Duncan's History of Rome or Revolutions or what's the other guy that everyone loved? Dan Carlin, Mike Duncan, I think, is much better than Dan Carlin, but whatever. It's a hot take. Maybe I'll lose some listeners with that, but I don't really care. I don't think you can really compare the two. I think Mike Duncan's in another class of his own and is a real stand-up guy. Huge Mike Duncan fan if you haven't already caught on yet. Anyways, let's get going on with this. Just wanted to let that be known. Oh yeah, and one other thing again, thanks to our Patreons. I've said this earlier. They've already received a curated book list. I don't know, something between 100 to 100 books. These are books that I've either read, had recommendations from, or are just well-known and really great books on these subjects and a lot of other subjects too. So please, guys, if you can spare $3, $5 a month, please. It makes such a big difference. Yes, you're not going to get maybe that much back as of now. I'll get you that list of curated book suggestions, which if you're a book nerd or a book whore, you'll love, and it'll be great. but it is mostly from the goodness of your heart, and it is really needed. This stuff is expensive. Recording platforms are expensive. Software is expensive. All this stuff is expensive, right? Mics aren't free. Mic stands aren't free. So your money goes a long way. Anyways, you're here to listen about the Greek Civil War and modern Greek history. So let's get on to that. We'll probably have like 1 or 2 more episodes on the monarchy, and then we'll move on to the communists, which is very interesting. For that one, I do actually have a co-host because I got that recorded a long time ago. And then we're going to get into MI6. I got another episode with Dr. Dale Pappas on Venizelism and republicanism, that kind of thing. So once we like get all the factions covered, then we'll be caught back right up to where we left off, right before the left, right, center, up, down, sideways, and everyone else start to gouge each other's eyes out, like around mid-1943-ish and on. In many cases, literally gouge each other's eyes out. So it's going to be fun, guys. It's going to be a fun time. So back to our story. We are in late 1920, early 1921, where we left off from last episode. And the Venizelos had lost in the elections. The Royalists were doing the usual post-election stuff, purges, cleaning up the house type stuff. So let's get back to those purges, right? There were some other big names we know of that were not impacted by this purge that we're at in our story right now. Like, and you guys will obviously recognize this name, Plastiras, who was just too popular and valuable to be relegated or replaced, and as a result, he remained in Asia Minor. Papagos as well, which, we know Papagos, commander-in-chief during the invasion of Greece in World War II, right? He was one of the Apoktakti, and he was given control of a cavalry regiment or something like that, which Papagos, Royalist general, not to be confused with Pangalos, Republican general. But he was Republican, but he was also more so just super ambitious. He was kind of his own general, right? But he was Republican, okay? So more so aligned with Venizelos. I know the names are similar and they can be confusing, but they are 2 different generals on opposite sides of the aisle. And also remember the Apoktakti we went over last episode. Those were generals and other military officers that were put into reserve during the Venizelos regime. And then when the Royalists came into power, they re-enlisted these Apoktakti, which the word, again, translates roughly to absentees in English, kind of, right? So anyways, moving on, because we aren't doing a deep dive on the Asia Minor campaign, as much as I would love to, let's try to get through what happens next as neatly as we can. So we are now at early 1921. The Royalists are stuck in an awkward position. They politically campaigned on calling off the military campaign in Asia Minor. But as we know, once they got into power, they expanded it and even continued the offensives that had been planned when the Venizelos military staff, generals, leaders, etc., were in power. And by end of May 1921, troop numbers had peaked around 200,000 in Asia Minor. So like an expansion, a serious expansion of operations. So that's one force that was at play, right? The Royalists. The other defining force was the international diplomacy of it all, and these forces had been set in motion from the moment Venizelos was out and when the king got back in. Almost immediately after the elections, France turned against Greece and focused on its positions in Syria and Cilicia, and then signed a separate peace with the Kemalists, providing them with military aid. The United States kind of dropped off the map after President Wilson's health went down the drain. And the Russians, I do mean the newly christened Soviet Union, had now pivoted from being at war with the Ottomans in World War I to now giving a massive amount of military and economic aid to the Kemalists. The internal situation, as in the cohesion of the Greek leadership and agreement on strategy, was on uneasy ground. The Venizelists, although formally ousted from power, were still scheming out of Constantinople via their group, the National Defense, or Amina, as it's called in Greek. This group didn't just include former Venizelist officers replaced by the Apoktakti, or generals who fled Asia Minor like Kondilis, but also important figures like the Patriarch in Istanbul, who was trying to help the situation in Asia Minor, and as a result, the Greeks in Istanbul were also very connected to all this. Their fates, after all, were linked to each other, right? In spring of 1921, a couple of other things happened. For starters, the government in Athens decides that it would be a good idea to put King Constantine at the head of the army, as in like a symbolic or ceremonial role, with Victor Douzmanis as his chief of staff, someone we had briefly mentioned back in our Little Moltke episodes, and who was a royalist who had been sentenced to life in prison after the Noembriana and was exiled in Corsica with Metaxas. The royalists, not wanting the British to lose faith with them and Greece in general, decided to pursue a goal of trapping and eliminating the Kemalist forces. This goal led them all the way to the outskirts of Ankara, which by the way is a Greek word for anchor, at the Sangarios River, or Sakarya as it's called in Turkish, where they failed to achieve their objective. During the battle, Prince Andrew, who Prince Andrew by the way was King Constantine I's brother, and he was also uncle of King Alexander I, apparently had refused to carry out a direct order. The battle results in a stalemate, which in this case was a strategic loss for the Greeks, and the Greek advancement was halted. By September of 1921, a stalemate had set in, and an orderly Greek retreat accompanied with a scorched earth policy took place. The failure at Sakarya resulted in General Papoulas resigning and General Hadzianestis taking over as commander-in-chief, who was off his fucking rocker, completely. He believed his legs were made of sugar, and as a result, I'm sorry, it's hard to say that without laughing, right? He believed his legs were made of sugar, and as a result, so brittle that they could shatter. Yes, this apparently was a mental condition called glass delusion. Died out apparently in like the late 1800s or whatever. Yeah. So like anyways, he was insane. He was batshit crazy. And he was much more incompetent than Papoulas as a commander, most importantly to our story, right? There was a lull in the campaign season, and about 1 year later, in August of 1922, we have the Battle of Dumlupinar, which, after the Battle of Dumlupinar, the gig was up. Unlike the Battle of Sakarya, where there was an organized retreat, there was what we call a rout, a hectic and unorganized retreat, a collapse. And by September, the Kemalist forces had reached Smyrna, and, well, we all know what happens next, right? I know I skipped over a lot there, but like I've said repeatedly, this is a primer, and in the future we'll have some more focused episodes on the Asia Minor campaign, episodes that grapple with very basic questions like, why did the Greeks lose? Was the campaign doomed from the start? Who is to blame? And like that kind of stuff, right? So we'll get around to that. I know the next part is something we covered in the primer episodes, but we'll go over them again. This time a tiny bit more in depth of what things really looked like. So, after the massacre at Smyrna, the unorganized mass of the Greek army got off the Aegean coast of Anatolia and made their way over to Mytilene, Chios, and just pretty much anywhere else they could to get the hell out of Anatolia. Of these forces and commanders that make it to Mytilene and Chios are Colonel Plastiras, we know who Plastiras is, and Gonatas, a lesser-known figure when compared to Plastiras, but still very consequential. These two colonels, along with Captain Phokas, who commanded the battleship Lemnos, form what would become known as the Revolutionary Committee. And again, this is all in primer episodes 1 through 4, right? The revolution, initiated by the Revolutionary Committee, started when an airplane dropped leaflets over Athens demanding the abdication of the king, the resignation of the government, the complete dissolution of the chamber, and the strengthening of the Thracian front, which, look on a map if you don't know where Thrace is, but it is on the border of Greece and Turkey. More specifically, Thrace is a region similar to Macedonia or Epirus. Eastern Thrace is sometimes called European Turkey. It is part of Turkey, obviously, and Western Thrace is part of Greece. Now, I don't know if you guys remember from like primer episode 1 or 2 or whatever, where I had mentioned this event where the Greeks were like preparing defensive lines in Thrace, and Basil was like, why would they do that? And I was like, well, to protect themselves from Kemal. And he was kind of like surprised And it does seem very surprising, especially when you think about how just a little over a year previously, the Greek troops were 40 or 60 miles away, just west of Ankara, right? But a lot can change in a day or a month or a year, right? So, the Greek front collapsed. And while it's not like the entire army had been annihilated or anything, not even close, the retreat was hectic and the army leadership was in disarray. If the Greek army stayed in disarray, demoralized and unable to reorganize itself, save a great power from stopping Kemal, which there were not many on the ground at the time, it is possible he could have threatened Thrace and Macedonia, meaning modern-day northeastern Greece and the city of Thessaloniki. After all, momentum was on their side now. Luckily, though, the Greek forces there were able to remobilize, so much so that Pangalos and Plastiras were actually begging Venizelos to let them march on Constantinople. So yeah, this was a legitimate concern. Anyways, as that day went on, September 26 of 1922, King Constantine's younger brother, Prince Nicholas, telegrammed the British to send a man of war, which is a general term meaning a giant warship, not to be confused with a man-o-war, which is a giant jellyfish. Maybe the two words are related, but that's what a man of war is. It's a giant warship, okay? So the king and his family and entourage realized they couldn't just leave on a Greek naval ship, right? That's because almost the entire navy had mutinied and wouldn't respond, aside from a couple of ships up in Constantinople. Which, by the way, if you are ever going to carry out a coup, it pays to have multiple branches of the military included. This is a prime example of that, right? As the day went on, Captain Fokas with the Lemnos steamed ahead towards Athens and made landfall near Cape Sunion later that evening. Around 7:30 p.m., the Revolutionary Committee, led by Llewelyn-Smith and Plastiras, gave an ultimatum to the government in Athens to accept the terms of the revolution, with a deadline 10 p.m. Then another ultimatum was given that gave the king until 5 a.m. Lucky for us, we have a first-hand account by none other than the Metaxas. So this is an account of the situation of that evening. Okay? And quote, I recommend to the king to abdicate quickly to avert further damage to his house if they form a government of Venizelists. To abdicate at once, we discuss further the last 2 years and the politics behind the scenes of the Asia Minor War. The king alone, without ministers, without civil servants, without friends. Telegraphic ultimatum about resignation arrives from the revolutionaries. We recommend that he should do so quickly. The revolutionaries are implacable on the question of the king. Papoulas confirms that the revolutionaries will allow the king freedom to choose where to live, within or outside Greece. The king decides to abdicate. He instructs me to compose a letter in proclamation of abdication. I am very moved. I stay near the king all day. And again, that was Metaxas, right? The same Metaxas that said no to the Italians, that died in, January 1941, right? So, by the way, it's just something else too. It's apparently the bit about Papoulas confirming that the king could live within or outside of Greece was denied by Llewelyn-Smith in his memoirs. So, just thought I'd throw that in there. Always remember, right? History, there are many different people telling the same story. So depending on the source, you might hear 2 or 3 different versions of what actually happened, especially when it's about things that happened, hundreds of years ago. On the morning of September 28th, 12,000 troops marched into Athens, and contrary to the poor state the army had retreated from Asia Minor in, according to the first-hand account of the British ambassador at the time, and quote, they were struck by their organized appearance, officers in the right places, pack animals properly loaded, horses in fair trim, and distances kept. They were in no sense a rabble. So the troops marched in, and the triumvirate of Plastiras, Llewelyn-Smith, and Fokas took over, which triumvirate, by the way, means ruled by 3, kind of like troika, right? I think the Greeks know that word, unfortunately, all too well. Gounaris, prime minister, Theotokis, war minister, Protopapadakis, finance minister, and prime minister in a royalist coalition government that ruled for a bit during the campaign, Stratos, interior minister, and Goudas, who was interior minister for a bit and had a couple other positions during the Asia Minor campaign, were all arrested at once. Metaxas as well was told outright by Llewelyn-Smith that he was under suspicion and was at risk of being arrested. The ever-brave Metaxas wrote in his diary in response, quote, "I am prepared to die for the freedom of the people." Ironic thing for a future dictator to write about, freedom of the people, but the Metaxas of 1936 isn't the Metaxas of 1922. We'll get more into Metaxas one day, soon enough. He still deserves a lot more for us to drill down on that guy. There's so much to talk about. So, around 5 p.m. the same day, the French and British ambassadors to Greece were able to get Plastiras and Llewelyn-Smith to agree to allow those arrested trial in a civil court, as opposed to military court, despite some anxieties of what the more extreme elements of the Republicans, including the Venizelists, would think of this compromise. The meeting went on where the issue of the current government was brought up, and the ambassadors asked something to the effect of, "Are you guys going to keep up this triumvirate or what?" Llewelyn-Smith apparently was very content with keeping things as they were, to which the British ambassador Lindley said something along the lines of, "You guys are colonels. You stick to military stuff. Let the politicians stick to government stuff." And apparently at this, Plastiras and Llewelyn-Smith laughed when they heard this, kind of like in agreement. Llewelyn-Smith ended up reading off a list of politicians to see what would be acceptable to the French and the British, and in essence, a kind of puppet government was set up with Alexandros Zaimis as prime minister and Venizelos as the Revolutionary Committee's representative abroad. The ever-monarchical loyalist Metaxas goes to the Tatui Palace to say goodbye. By the way, some of this we already covered over and, quoted in previous episodes, but it's a really great scene. And quote, "I tell him he will not return to his throne, but will live happily as a private citizen. He accepts all this. He simply wants to live in his own home. The queen is very dignified. The king says he has always had confidence in me and still has. A moving farewell." So ended the reign of Constantine. And as we know, unlike the first time King Constantine was ousted in the Novembriana, Metaxas fought against Entente troops, that will not be the case this time. King Constantine leaves for his second and last exile and dies in Palermo in January of 1923. His son, King George II, is the new king, for now. Now from this point, we can dive into a lot of different topics, go into a lot of different directions. We can talk about the diplomatic front, where in a nutshell, an armistice was signed, formally ending military operations. This armistice of Mudanya, as it's known as, was signed on October 11th, not just by Turkey and Greece, but also by the British, the French, and the Italians, who, remember, were all players in the fiasco in Asia Minor. Or we can talk about the already massive refugee flows that occurred once word got out that Eastern Thrace would no longer be held by the Greeks, which caused every Greek, quite literally every Greek in that area, for lack of better terminology, to get the fuck out and head west towards Greece before the Turks got there. Because, my lord, if you're a Greek in Eastern Thrace, you do not want to fucking be there when Turks arrive. No way, Jose. So that resulted in something like 500,000 refugees, I believe, just from Eastern Thrace. But we won't be diving into any of these topics as much as I'd love to. This is a royalty primer. So let's get back to the new king, King George II, a king we probably know the best about at this point, and who will be around until mid-1947 when he kicks the bucket. So, back to the position of the monarchy and its supporters in Greece. On October 17th, the Revolutionary Committee issued a manifesto, which gives us a look into the sentiment of the group at that time, where they state, and quote, "The revolution cannot rest content with the resignation of Constantine, because the political and military Constantinist clique must be neutralized. The revolution proclaims unity, but unity would be immoral if it signified the forgetting or putting aside of responsibilities and the confusion of innocent and guilty. The exemplary punishment of the enemies of the country is therefore necessary." So, I mean, you don't have to read too much between the lines, right? It's pretty direct. People mean a specific thing when they use words like neutralized, right? We've all watched spy movies and stuff like that and whatnot. So when someone says neutralized, I feel like they're mostly talking about killing. Call me crazy, but yeah. So they're pretty straightforward on that, right? Anyways, 2 days later, on October 19th of 1922, the Revolutionary Committee sets up a, quote, commission of inquiry, headed by General Pangalos, who you may know, that's the guy who sets up a short dictatorship after all of this, where he mandates the length of women's skirts and cuts the currency in half and all that stuff. Again, mostly known as Republican, who uses republicanism more as an escalator to the top than believing in any real ideals. And in this setting, he is the hardliner end of the Revolutionary Committee. Plastiras and Llewelyn-Smith knew this about him. They were aware that he was a hardliner and that he was taking a very tough stance on all of this. But they also knew that at this point, it wasn't politically possible to not appease the hardliners from their end of the aisle. So Pangalos' appointment was a kind of signal that the hardliners would be placated. Within 1 week after the appointment of Pangalos, 2 more big signals are given as to the direction the Revolutionary Committee was heading, which, by the way, from now on, I'm just calling it the RC for short, okay? RC, Revolutionary Committee. So the first big announcement, the ministers arrested would be tried via a special court-martial, not in civil court. The second big thing that happened was that Prince Andrew, King Constantine's younger brother, and Yorgos Baltazis, who was a foreign minister in the Gounaris government during the Asia Minor campaign, are also both arrested. Big things are happening. And on that note, that's all we got for today. So join us next time as we take a deeper look into the aftermath of everything, into the trial and the execution, spoiler alert there, sorry guys, the execution of the 6. Take care everyone, adios, bye-bye.